Right, let's talk about fire combat in Panzer Corps. And by fire combat, the rules mean ranged combat, to distinguish it from a couple of examples where battalions actually come into direct close contact with each other. Most of those instances are covered by the close combat rules, which I'll cover in another video, and there's also an example during the movement phase. AFV's tanks can conduct overruns of infantry units. But we're going to talk about fire combat in this video, and specifically where battalions, tanks, infantry fire on each other. There's a third sort of fire combat, which is artillery bombardment. I'll cover that in a different video, although the mechanics are quite similar. A lot of the examples of how you bring the fire to bear require special rules, so I'll cover them separately. So in this video we're going to talk about one battalion firing at range on another. Now the firing takes place after movement, so there's the turn sequence is the logistics phase where you rally off disorder and so on. There's then an artillery bombardment phase, which includes air attacks, and then there's movement, where both sides move all their forces, or as many as they can, with the decision dies, and then you move into the fire phase. And in the fire phase, all units, if they're in range and have line of sight and so on, can fire. It isn't like the movement phase where you have to roll a dice to get your units to move. In the firing phase you can fire all your units if they're eligible. The player with initiative goes first and they fire all of their units, and then the other player fires back. Now this fire is not simultaneous, in the sense that if I fire one of my battalions and damage one of yours, fragment it, say, so it can't fire, then it won't be able to fire back. It is simultaneous on one side, though, in the sense that I have to decide before firing any of my battalions who they're going to fire at. I can't fire one salvo and then see what the effect is and then decide whether to fire another one at the same target or move on to a different target. So I designate all my targets, and then all my battalions will fire, and then you fire back with the remaining battalions, those that can still fire, and suffering the ill effects of any damage, any disorder that I may have put on you during that firing. Okay, so the first thing to say is that before you can fire on something you have to be able to see it, and so I'll quickly mention the spotting rules here. Very simple table, really. Any unit, any formation can attempt to spot once during a turn, and typically it'll spot an area like maybe the edge of a wood, and it'll use this simple table here to decide whether it sees anything, assuming that anything is there. As you can see, if targets are in the open, particularly if they're moving or if they're firing, then acquisition is pretty much automatic. But if a unit is hidden in a wood, and particularly if the spotting unit is a tank, then sometimes it can be quite tricky to acquire your target. And this is where having a recon company attached to your battalion can be quite useful, because that gives you a modifier, a plus modifier on your chances to spot. Within 5 inches or 5 centimeters in the smaller scale, spotting is automatic anyway, whatever the conditions. And I should also say that it is quite common within scenarios to have the scenario designer put a spotting limit, a line of sight limit overall, either because of weather conditions or because of the ground. If it is close, lots of fields and hedgerows and woods and so on, then the designer may say that there is a limit to the distance that a unit can see under any circumstances. So okay, let's assume that you've spotted your enemy, and you've got a battalion and you want to fire at your enemy battalion or enemy formation. How do you do it? And the basic model is very simple. Firing of this sort is an opposed die roll. The firer, the firing formation, rolls what's called a fire die. This can be of various different sizes, as is quite common in the Panzer Corps mechanics, and I'll show you the rules in a moment as to how you decide what size of die to roll. And there are also quite a number of modifiers which go with this roll, but at the end of the day you roll one die of the appropriate size, add and subtract modifiers, and come to a score. The target has what's called a cover die, And again, this depends on various things, which I'll talk about in a moment. There are no modifiers to this die. You decide how big it is, what size, whether it's a D4 all the way up to a D12, and then you roll it. And the two scores are compared. If the cover die is equal to or greater than the firing die, that's it. There's no problem, no effect. If the firing die exceeds the cover die, then you get at least one disorder marker on the target. If you can double the score on the cover die, you get 2, and if you can triple it, then you get 3, and that's the maximum number of disorder markers from a single example of firing. Just a couple of things I should mention. If either of the scores come out as a 1, if there's a natural 1 on the cover die, or if you score a 1 or less on the firing die, then some bad things happen. I'll go into a little bit more detail about those elsewhere, but briefly, if the firing die is a 1 or less, then you have a risk of running low on ammo. If the cover die is a 1, then if you have attachments in the target formation, then one of them is removed, and if you have decorated leaders, then one of them is killed. So 1 is a bad thing on the cover die, and one of the things that you have to try very hard to do is to avoid rolling a D4 for your cover die, because if you do that, then you've got a 25% chance of scoring a 1 and having those bad things happen to you, in addition to any disorder that you may take. Okay, so let's look at how we determine the size of the two dice and the modifiers to the fire die. This is the play sheet which is used for this sort of fighting. On the left hand side, you've got the fire dice determining table for what they call infantry or indirect fire. This is fire, generally speaking, at infantry targets using small arms or high explosives. On the right hand side is the equivalent table for what they call AFVs, or more precisely anti-tank or armor piercing fire, and that table is used where you have a formation, a battalion firing armor piercing ammunition at essentially an armored fighting vehicle target. So if you've got tanks or anti-tank guns firing, and you have a target which is an armoured target, again tanks, tank destroyers or whatever, then you use that table. But tanks firing at infantry, infantry firing at infantry, and indeed, as you'll see in another video, artillery firing at infantry, all use the left-hand table. So let's zoom in on that a little bit, and the basic idea here is that the fire die, the size of it, is determined by the quality of your firing unit. And that goes, as we've seen in other videos, in other contexts, all the way up from the very poorest quality, militia or partisans, up through reservists and regulars, through to elite and hardened troops, who are the best. And you look at the type, the quality of your firing formation, and that gives you the base fire die. So, for example, if it's regulars, you throw a D10. I should say the second column there, suppressed. If your formation, your firing formation, is suppressed, in other words, it's got between 3 and 5 disorder markers, then it will use the die in the right-hand column, which, as you can see, is poorer in every case than the one it will use when it's not suppressed. Below that, there are the modifiers that you will use for the fire die. Pluses and minuses, and there's quite a lot of them. I'm not going to read through them in detail. Many of them are determined by attachments. So the very first one there, you can see if you've got a medium machine gun attachment to your firing battalion, you get +1 on your firing die. The others are about the tactical situations, so there's one there, you get +1 if you're firing into the flank of your target. Some of them, again, will be about the situation for the firing unit. So there's one down there which says -1 if the target moved, but also having moved. In other words, if you've moved, you also get a -1. -2 for target entrenchment, and -2 for the target being an AFV. Remember, this is, as it were, small arms fire or HE fire. If you're firing, so if an infantry battalion is firing at a tank battalion, a tank target, then that's inherently more difficult to score hits, to score damage with, and you get a -2 for that. But it is possible. I mean, remember, these are battalions, so we're not just talking about a few rifles firing. There will be all sorts of other equipment. Some infantry are equipped with Piats, for example, in which case they'll get extra points there. If they have anti-tank companies with the attached to the battalion, again you'll see there is a +2, I think, for the anti-tank company when you're firing at an armoured target, which will negate their AFV benefits. So quite a lot of adjustments there for the attachments for the firing battalion, for the tactical situation, and for various other specifics. Let's look now at how you choose the fire die when you are an anti-tank or armour-piercing battalion firing. I've said anti-tank there. That would only apply if you had an anti-tank battalion. As we've just seen, if you have anti-tank attachments to infantry battalions, then those are represented as pluses, and you use the infantry table and the infantry fire die. But if you have an anti-tank battalion, or more commonly, I guess, if you have a tank destroyer or a tank battalion, then the fire die is determined not by the quality of the troops, but by the caliber of the main guns that are firing. And you can see there that if you've got a small autocannon, something 20mm or less, you just roll a d4. All the way up through the various ranges of guns up to the very largest ones, which will use a d10 or a d12. Again, there are modifiers to this fire die. These are quite different from the others. There are, as before, quite a few which relate to the attachments that you have to your battalion, in this case your tank battalion typically. In this case you get benefits for being at short range. You also get benefits for firing from behind, and you lose score if, for example, your target is entrenched. You will also notice down at the bottom there are adjustments for the quality of the troops. If you remember, in infantry terms, the quality determined the size of the fire die. Here, that size is determined by the caliber of the guns, but the quality still has a relevance. Recruits will fire much more poorly than elite or veteran troops, and therefore there are adjustments to the fire die score. So now we know what size of die we're going to be throwing and the adjustments we're going to be making to it. The final thing we have to do is determine the size of the cover die, and that's done on this table here. We're looking mostly at the top part of the table, and by contrast with the fire die, the cover die is relatively simple. As I mentioned earlier, there are no adjustments to it, and you simply determine the size of the die from effectively the protection that the target has. So on the left hand side you have protection relevant to infantry, or those defending against indirect fire, and that's essentially, are they in the open, and that's the nightmare situation. Infantry caught in the open with no cover, roll a d4. Then you have light cover, medium cover, heavy and super heavy cover. That's going up through things like woodland, entrenchments, hastily dug trenches, more well-established entrenchments and trenches, buildings, towns and cities, and finally the super heavy cover relates, I think, to very specific things like the Atlantic Wall and properly built concrete emplacements. On the right hand side, the equivalent cover die list is for armoured vehicles. So this is for the target taking incoming fire from armour piercing, and again, as you can see, being in a soft skinned battalion in those circumstances is bad news. You get a d4. Light, medium, heavy and super heavy armoured fighting vehicles, those are within the equipment lists. You can tell, as you might expect, a Panzer 1 or 2 is a light vehicle, a 3, a 4 is going to be medium, a Tiger is going to be a heavy tank, and that determines the size of the die that you roll for your cover. As you can see there in the table, it repeats the information that I gave you about what happens once that roll is made. You're trying to beat the cover die if you're the firer. You're trying to beat it well. Again, you'll notice that if you roll a 1, then that makes it very easy for the firer to triple you. So not only do you lose an attachment and perhaps a decorated leader, you also very probably wind up with 3 disorder markers, which is going to mean an immediate morale test and very likely a morale failure. So very important to try and make sure your cover die is as good as it can be. And as I say, the big disaster is finding yourself as infantry trapped in the open. One thing I should say, an assumption is made that if infantry don't move in the open, they will automatically dig, at the very least, light cover for themselves, simple entrenchments. Remember, a turn is anything from half an hour to 2 hours, so the infantry are not going to be standing around in the open. They will at least give themselves a chance by giving themselves light cover. Just mention the parts at the bottom of that table. This is for cover die shifts in armoured vehicles against artillery or air bombardment. When you've got very heavy artillery incoming or very heavy bombs being dropped, then the excuse me, the effect of armour becomes much less. The armour of a Tiger isn't really very much use against a naval shell. So those shifts, I'll talk about those when we come onto the artillery and the air rules. So there you are. That's the principle of ranged combat in Panzer Corps. This is most combat. It's fairly rare for battalions to come to hand-to-hand blows. Usually you will degrade your enemy with fire, both artillery and direct fire from your battalions, and get them to break and fall back so that you can occupy their positions rather than actually having to shift them at the point of a bayonet, although that does happen, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So I think I will do a couple of examples, but you've now seen all the theory sufficient to conduct the ranged combat of both types in the Panzer Corps rules.